An economy is supposed to provide peace and prosperity, and it is only with capitalism that we get the greatest distribution of goods and services at the highest quality for the lowest price. But how is all that done? Well, to understand that, you need to know what makes up an economy and what affects it. So that means you need to understand what a positive and negative feedback loop is and how all of this works together. So what is an economy? An economy is your input, throughput, and output. So it's input, that is your raw resources and labor and capital. Throughput, that's your businesses. That's actually taking those resources and producing something. And what are they producing? Your output. That's your finished goods and services. But all of that occurs within a fence for an economy. So like for the United States, that would be our legal, tariff, tax, and regulatory structures. And yeah, it expands out to the world depending on, the legal and the tariff and the tax and all that. But all of it occurs with units that have a backing, means, and method. And those units are produced by issuers. Go watch previous videos to understand every one of these things. Remember, the unit, that's the money. The means, well, that's how it's going to transmit. And the method, well, that's your platform that all of that economic activity is occurring with. And that economic activity is what? The inputs, throughputs, and outputs. The raw resources, the businesses that are taking that and creating a good, and then the outputs, how you're going to sell it. But it all occurs in between this fence that the legal, tariff, and tax and regulatory structure creates, okay? And when all of this works together, it creates a price, all right? And what does a price do? A price directs capital and resources. Why? So it can create the entrepreneurial activity. And what does that entrepreneurial activity do? That creates the greatest distribution at the highest quality for the lowest price of any good or service. And this informs the wage negotiation. So let's take a good and a service and a situation. So Katrina happened, New Orleans. Case of water goes through the roof. All right. Now, this is a signal to the broader economy. All these entrepreneurs look at that price of that case of water. Even though it's a bunch of human suffering, they say, well, guess what I can do? I can go buy it for less here, go over there, and sell for more because there's a profit margin. But see, everybody thinks like that. So then you have all of this supply flooding to this area, which drops the cost, drops the prices. This is the invisible hand of the market, okay? This is how the greatest distribution at the highest quality with the lowest price occurs. But it only happened because the prices were allowed to fluctuate. So if you put a price cap on that bottle of water, that case of water, all of that supply wouldn't have flowed there. You see, the market got the wrong information from the wrong price. And this all has to do with wage negotiation at the end of the day, because labor is just another resource. So if there's, now let's take another example, labor unions. Early 20th century, labor unions necessary. It created collective bargaining, and that's a free market principle. Every capitalist will agree with it. You don't have to be a communist to agree with collective bargaining. And because those industries that the unions were in got better working conditions, pensions, etc., other industries that didn't have unions were forced to add that into the wage negotiation and employment negotiation. See, that's a positive feedback loop. But why could that even occur in the first place? Well, because back then, we had a money that was static in value. We had the proper legal, tariff, tax, and regulatory structure for all that economic activity to happen. So what does that mean? That means that the businesses had the proper profit margin. And that profit margin is the gap by which corporate and labor can then negotiate in the wage negotiation to equal it out, to balance it out, to divvy up the pie more, because it all occurred within the correct fence height. Because the fence is your legal tariff, tax, and regulatory structure, and the ground that you're on, that's your money, and it has to occur with a method and means, so that all that economic activity with input, throughput, and output can then take place for the greatest distribution at the highest quality with the lowest price, right? But when there's any malfeasance in any of this calculation at all, prices no longer become true representations of what things should cost and what the profit you could have. So therefore, this whole thing collapses. Now, what causes all that malfeasance? Well, what's the type of money that you're using? Can you flood the supply of it and therefore create inflation and screw up all the prices? Well, that matters. Is regulatory structures too onerous, which is constraining your throughput activity, your businesses? Well, that matters. Taxes too, that takes away the pure profit. And what's your tariffs? If you have low tariffs in your country, well then all these other countries that don't have unions or all this other stuff will outcompete those that do here. So you have to have the correct tariff structure. And what's the legal structure? Is there a lot of tort or legal actions that are being done against these companies, which takes away the margin because it's all going to insurance after that? So for 60 years, this whole thing has had either positive or negative feedback loops. So with labor unions, they started to become corrupt and started to pay politicians to get elected, to get the labor unions more power. But those politicians spent us into oblivion, which made those entire industries lose their profit margin and go overseas. So now the union compounds it by saying, well, we need higher wages now, which forces more of the companies to leave. So now Trump's trying to redo this entire calculation and set it right. And with the Genius and Clarity Act, we can choose our issuer and our unit, judge the pedigree of the backing, have a means and method that is neutral. So that sets the foundation there. And then what's the fence? The fence is your legal tariff, tax, and regulatory structure. And then so all the input, throughput, and output can then occur for the correct prices, because now everything's on chain. So you get rid of the fraud, you get rid of the naked short selling, and the money actually matters now. So now it can direct capital and resources correctly for us all to have the wage negotiation that is properly beneficial. And those wages then retain their value. And then entrepreneurial activity can occur, which means we have the greatest distribution of goods and services at the highest quality for the lowest price. And what does all that mean? Peace and prosperity. So that's what an economy is. And if you'd like to talk more about this, ask questions or whatnot, join us tonight at 6:30 p.m. on Vincent SCO 72192 X account. Tip and subscribe for more. Thanks.